Good morning. Good morning. All right. I know in Georgia you have the same tradition that I am. Those of us who are people of African ancestry, we understand what it means to be a part of a moment when indeed conversation means engagement. So I tell people all the time, I'm always looking for some kind of response. You know, you can nod, you can wink. If you choose to say amen, that's all right too. But and even if you disagree, say just let me know you hear me one way or another, all right? Let me say first to Bishop Shields, thank you so very much for hosting us, for allowing me to be here with you today, and it is indeed an honor. You would have gotten Stephen Wakefield from Seattle here today, except Steve is actually having surgery this morning, and ask you guys just to be in prayer with him. I'm going to shift my thoughts just a little bit, because since I'm speaking first, I feel like maybe I have to say some things, hopefully, that will help us to frame this day. Because indeed, as we go about the business of addressing HIV vaccine trials and the ways in which we need to be involved, there's a sense in which it's important to have a framework. It's important to have some construct, some rubric, something that allows us to be able to understand that it's within a certain kind of parameter, it's within a certain kind of understanding that we have to approach this work. One of the things I have discovered over and over again is that too often the thing that ends up being the stumbling block between us and the ability to achieve the things that we're trying to accomplish in relationship to this particular initiative is that there is a spirit that has to come with it. There are some principles, there are some ideals, there are some values, there are some rudimentary, fundamental things that I'm convinced have to be operative if we're going to do the work effectively. If it was just about the science, we'd be probably not having this session today, because the people who are doing the science are working as vigorously, as hard as they can to advance the understanding of how a vaccine might be brought into the arena. But what people who do the science understand, and what we who are involved with trying to make sure that the response to this disease is as comprehensive and complete as we can make it, realize that it doesn't work without partnership. It doesn't work without relationship. It doesn't work without us somehow being able to engage, being able to involve, being able to connect with those persons who are being impacted and affected by this disease. There's a sense in which many of us in this room are here because we represent a community that are disproportionately impacted. We represent a community that in too many instances has found itself being victimized by this reality in a way that we need to understand what we need to bring to the table in order to be effective. The slide that's here is a very interesting one, because at the same time that you might say that, you know, it's clear that when we talk about the project, we talk about breaking the silence and how we come to the point where people are talking honestly, forthrightly, and directly about this issue of vaccine trials and why people of color are not involved more than they are. There's a sense in which when you look at this slide, when we first put it together, it was really intended to be representative of ethnicity, intended to be representative of race, intended to be representative of the ways in which we are many different people, but yet there is this silence. But I've come to where I think more and more that the hands that we see are more than that which just represents the ethnic reference to the people who are there. Because what are those things? What do those hands represent? I'm convinced those hands represent the fear. The hands represent the stigma. The hands represent the denial. The hands represent the fear. The hands represent the racism. The hands represent the homophobia. The hands represent all the stuff that gets in the way of us being able to effectively and forthrightly deal with this disease. What is it that is keeping us from speaking? What is it that is keeping us from responding? What is it that is keeping us from standing up? And I'm convinced we're here today to try to understand what those things are. Because the better we understand them, the more effectively we'll be able to respond as a community in terms of that which we need to do. So we want to talk for a minute about how we began to move in that regard. Let me just share with you just a little bit about who I am, because in doing that, I'm convinced it helps to create the framework. I serve a congregation called Metropolitan Interdenominational Church. If you walk in Metropolitan Sanctuary, the one thing that probably is most prominent that you instantly find yourself being drawn to is a very large painting, which is actually larger than even this represents on this screen, of a word that basically is at the heart of who we are at Metropolitan Church. And that word is the word whosoever. To do this work, there's a way in which you have to very quickly learn how to move beyond all the things that have systematically fragmented and divided. You have to learn to move beyond the things that have excluded and left out people from within the circle of inclusion. Within the circle of inclusion as relates to our communities of faith and our communities where we live and respond all the time. If you're going to do this work, there's a way in which you have to somehow move beyond that stuff, which has translated into the barriers, the stumbling blocks, and the obstacles that are very difficult for us to overcome in this society and in this world. Some people ask me at times, why am I so excited about doing the work? Where does my passion, where does my enthusiasm come from? One of the things I tell folks all the time is one reason why I'm so excited about doing this work around HIV is that if we effectively address HIV, we will also effectively address all the other things that are our ills and that are our problems in our societal framework and in the world in which we live. Because ultimately, you cannot deal with HIV in isolation. You cannot deal with HIV without talking about economic opportunity. You can't talk about HIV without talking about housing and access to health care. You can't talk about HIV without talking about a criminal justice system that somehow translates into an experience which disproportionately is impacting so many folks who are people of color, the dispossessed, the left out, and the disinherited in our society. So there's a way in which when we talk about the vaccine, we have to understand it in the context of something that is much bigger than the vaccine in and of itself, because indeed the vaccine ends up being one of the strategies. It ends up being one of the ways in which we'll be able to effectively address this disease and the way in which it's manifesting itself in the world. But yet it's a piece that we have to have. And for us not to be involved in a way that allows our input to be a part of how the research and how the science is going forward, it leaves us compromised in terms of whether or not it will work for us. So I'm convinced that we have to talk about solving this problem and dealing with this issue in a way that fully accepts the fact that we have to deal with this broader sense of things that are a problem for us in our world and our time. At Metropolitan Church, we talk about being citizens of the world, and I think that's important if we're going to mobilize people in response to this issue of vaccine trials. There's a sense in which we have to understand, yes, it's about our neighbors, it's about our children, it's about our family, it's about our friends, it's about the people who we interact with all the time, but yet it's about those who we don't see, those who are distant, and those who are even in far-off lands. There's a way in which we find ourselves, I'm convinced, having to appreciate that when we do this work, it's important to see ourselves as being citizens of the world, connected to, involved with, and engaged in dealing with people all over the world. There's an image that I don't have up here today, which I often like to project in that regard. It's one of the first images, one of the first pictures that was taken from outer space when there was human beings traveling into outer space. And the thing that was so powerful in the first pictures that came back were the pictures of Earth. And I remember one of the astronauts commenting on the fact that the thing that was most dramatic is that there were no lines, there were no borders, there were no points of division. The things that end up for us being the basis upon which we segment, separate, segregate, and cut each other off from each other are not there. I'm convinced HIV gives us a picture like that. There are no borders, there are no lines, there are no distinctions in terms of that which comes between and fragments. And I'm convinced for us to do this work, we have to understand that we have to assume this posture of being citizens of the world. We talk about three things at Metropolitan Church all the time, and those things are included in this particular message. And it's basically talking about the fact that we see it being essential for us to be inclusive, reconciling, and engaged. And I'm convinced that that's a part of the framework. Remember what I'm laying out for you now. Framework, backdrop, structure, rubric, okay, paradigm that we have to work within. Because if indeed we do not work within that kind of understanding, then I'm convinced we sometimes end up being ineffective in that which we're trying to do. What do we mean when we talk about being inclusive? I'm convinced we're saying that there's a way in which we have to learn to see each other in a way that allows us to get beyond